afternoon, everyone, and welcome to ORF. This not so pleasant afternoon outside, but very pleasant inside. And we are here to discuss a very interesting topic, and because we are releasing a monograph on the ISIS phenomena. Let me start by congratulating Kabir, who has led this project at ORF for a while now. And who has been working on the topic for the whole year, culminating in this publication. So congratulations, Kabir, and we are here to launch this today. We are also very fortunate to have an excellent set of panelists with us today. Ajay Sahni, Praveen Swami, and Ambassador Fabian, who will be discussing this and commenting on this publication after the initial set of remarks by Kabir. But I would just like to mention a few things. One, that when we started this last year, we realized or recognized a challenge that the public policy space in India was facing. There was a lot of information, but very little analysis happening about the sources, about the challenges, about the policy responses to it, how to adequately address that. There was a lot of discussion around this in the policy domain, but it was, if one were to look at Indian academics or Indian policy think tanks, there was relatively little work going on around the subject. Recognizing that, we started an ISIS tracker, tracking the activities of those who have been following ISIS for a while. And building upon that, we have had 3 sets of publications now over the last year. One which had tended to look at the phenomena from outside in, so looking at the challenges that the Middle East is facing, with a very distinct Indian perspective, not primarily looking at it through the prism of Indian foreign and security policy, but looking at the phenomena as it was emerging in the region itself. So what were the regional debates, what were the regional dynamic, and what were the regional architecture that was creating this problem and the policy responses that were emanating there. And then as ISIS' so-called decline, disintegration happened, the challenges that have started emerging around beyond Middle East, beyond West Asia, into South Asia and India, that is the focus of the 2 papers here in this monograph, where we looked at the challenge that India faces or broader South Asian region faces as a result of this phenomena. So I think broadly what we have tried to do here as part of this publication, as part of this project, is to look at the multidimensional nature of this problem, both from outside in and inside out, and hopefully to generate a response, to generate a debate in the policymaking community, as well as giving or thrusting this debate into the academia, if you will, looking at the challenges. So now let me start by, once again, congratulating Kabir and asking him to give you a brief overview of the project, some of the findings, before we formally launch this, and then we'll go on to our panelists for the panel discussion.
Thank you, Professor Pant, for chairing this discussion today. A quick sort of history of why we started this first. Of course, as Professor Pant mentioned, there was very little understanding of what ISIS was from an Indian context. Around 2014 and 2015. In 2014, of course, Baghdadi announced the formation of the caliphate, the so-called caliphate. And since then, we've had very little literature in India on understanding how the phenomenon is working. It was very different from the traditional subjects that have been studied in this field before. So, I mean, Al-Qaeda, Indian Mujahideen, and other groups of both domestic and international in nature. So, as mentioned before, the first task was to understand what ISIS is, where it has come from, who are the people behind it, why these people decided to take this route, and to what extent were they willing to go to achieve their aims. It was a very difficult task, and I'll get to that in a minute of why it was so. The second part of this research focused on South Asia. Now, one of the first sort of propaganda materials that came out of the ISIS camp, which sort of showed South Asia as part of the extended caliphate, so to speak, was around early 2015, where maps showing South Asian geography drenched in the ISIS flag started to show up. Not from the supposedly official media sources of ISIS, which is Amaq and others, but this was coming from specific social media accounts, specifically on Twitter, which was being used very heavily by ISIS at that point of time, and was being tweeted out by anonymous accounts of ISIS sympathizers and supporters, purportedly from South Asia, but there were others who were from South Asian descent, but living in Europe and Britain. So the second paper actually looks at a lot at Bangladesh, where after the artisan bakery attack, a lot of interest was garnered. I spent a few days in Dhaka trying to understand how they were looking at the problem, and they were facing a very similar situation to what other states were facing, including India at that point of time, which was the influence was visible at that point, but there was no clarity of what they could do about it. And it was very difficult to formulate policies in both countering terrorism or countering violent extremism, countering violent groups. But one thing that was missing, which most states were struggling, was countering violent narratives. It was very difficult to push back on the use of the internet by ISIS, which was not sporadic in nature. It was designed. It was very well designed. It was very well informed on how the internet works, what people's habits are on the internet, and how do they consume information, and where specific people who are looking for this sort of information reside. So, so even if they were visible on Twitter or on Facebook at that point of time, which they were, that was mostly for the benefit of creating fear and paranoia in the general populations, not just in the Middle East but around the world. But they took on to more specific online routes, especially on Facebook in 2015, when it was fairly easy to spread ISIS propaganda without any repercussion from Facebook itself. It is a bit different now. They are trying to fight back, but it took that much amount of time to actually understand of what ISIS was doing and how to fight back. So that's predominantly what the second paper deals with. The third paper, of course, is the culmination of, as Professor Pant mentioned, the ISIS tracker. The ISIS tracker, I'll just see if this is working. Yeah, okay. So, so that's the front page basically. So what we have done is we have about 117 names that we have studied in this, and these are ones that we have corroborated during our research and using the NIA databases and independent. Some of them are independently verified as well, but this is not necessarily the total number of pro-ISIS people in India. It's very difficult to sort of come to any sort of conclusion. But this is the number of cases that have been either registered or are being pursued by the authorities. And some of them also include just based on media reports, but the authorities are still not releasing much data about them. But we have mentioned them anyway. So we started corroborating data from 2014, which was one of the first reports of pro-ISIS actors in India came up in the Indian media, and we've gone from 15, 16, 17, 18. As I said, this was not easy, but this was possible to do because the effects of ISIS is very limited in India. So the numbers do not go into thousands, the numbers don't go even into hundreds. The data set is possible to track because there are not enough cases to begin with. So that allowed us to try and study trends and see whether these trends are similar to ones faced by other countries in the West, specifically in Europe, whether the behavioral patterns of these people who were showing inclinations towards the Islamic State was similar to what they were in Europe. What were the criteria behind their movements? One of the most difficult tasks one of the most important tasks to study in this field is the process between supporting the Islamic State and moving towards traveling to Syria to join the Islamic State. The process in between that is where most authorities have the opportunity to catch or arrest these people. If the process is completed, it's very difficult to go after them. So just to understand that process from an academic or a scholarly perspective was a task in itself. So if I mean, we struggled. A lot of hypotheses and theories that we formulated in the beginning of the study, expecting what to find, was absolutely washed away by the middle of the study, because it was that difficult to find either patterns or your hypothesis that you had thought could be same as the ones studied by Britain or Germany or France. It was not the case. Strangely, the most common commonality we found with another country facing similar situations or similar cases was with Canada. So, for example, the Indian pro-ISIS individuals showed an inclination only to move or to organize or to travel in groups. Contrary to Europe, where a lot of so-called lone wolf attacks were happening, people were being pushed to individually take action against general population or the police or other such institutions. In India, there were attempts made by the Islamic State to try and push individuals to commit attacks within their localities or within the towns and within the cities. And almost none of those cases came to any conclusion, because bizarrely, the most common factor of why that never happened was the general ineptness of the people themselves. Right? So they were not the smartest people that they were targeting. And contrary to popular belief, of what I think was a very important part, is that ISIS also realized that a lot of educated, smart people were trying to join their ranks. But in the cases that at least we have studied for this project, I can safely say 85% of them were cases that certain parts of the Islamic State online community. So that's not necessarily just the ISIS hierarchy, the official ISIS hierarchy. It could be just a pro-ISIS, influential pro-ISIS account pushing people to do things. But even then, they failed to, in some cases, they just failed to explain people how to get passports. They failed to explain people what residential, how residential verifications was for them to get papers, how finance moves, or even basic stuff like buying weapons from the black market. People in general being targeted in India were failing to grasp these basic aspects for them. And you can see, if you study these cases, you can see, and if you go through the chart sheets, you can see a decline in the ISIS online community trying to push agendas into India. Of course, this is, a large section of what they were trying to achieve in India from online propaganda perspective failed from the onset anyway. So these are the only few cases that that showed some inclination towards ISIS or joining ISIS or doing something in ISIS name. So this is how the tracker looks like. Basically, it has an update bar which we update as soon as corroborated information is made public. We try our best to filter out poor reporting. So a lot of stuff that you may read every day actually doesn't turn up here, because it's just a lot of time it's fluff. And we have a database by name. This is corroborated mostly by the NIA databases. We had the opportunity to also use other sources, but again, you're playing with identities here, so it's a very sensitive matter. So we stuck to mostly NIA databases. Some of them were public for consumption, so you can go to the NIA website and see them. Some of them were not, so we got some access through the authorities as well. And we've mapped it out, so you can see most of the influential states that have seen most of the 117 cases come out of. Kerala is, of course, the single largest. I think in our database of 117, there are 43 cases from Kerala. Contrary to a lot of popular belief, what some people may expect, from Kashmir, we had one case and nothing more. After Kerala, I think the second was Maharashtra with the most number of cases. Bengal and Gujarat followed with that. Of course, this was just using data sets, officially available data sets was just one part of it. We also used, which I have found is very important in this field now for scholars to get acquainted to, is the use of open source intelligence. Geolocation, just knowing how to trawl social media to find information using algorithms. These are new age tools that need to be incorporated into scholarly work too. Because as I said, one of the reasons why this project was hard, because we were trying to track something which is happening in real time at a furious pace. So if you're trying to study ISIS and you're using their online presence as the main base, you have to be on your toes 24/7. So you have to have data collection that is happening on social media or otherwise, or their closed forums where they also operate, darknet, and a host of other places. And to collect that data is also manpower intensive. This is what I was talking about. So open source intelligence. This is something I've been using, or I've been part of actually pre my ORF days. So you can see this is from August 2015. The gray area marked is what Islamic State basically controlled in August 2015. This data was corroborated using social media posts being posted by the radicals. So it could be ISIS, it could be some of the other groups. But this predominantly, the gray area was where ISIS was present at that point of time. It's not fully accurate, obviously, but it's pretty close. And you can see the movement after some time. So in August 2016, you can see the gray area has shrunk a little bit. The red area increased, which is the Syrian government. The green area is militias at that point of time that were being aided by the Americans. You can see how slowly the activity was moving northwards towards Aleppo and Hama. Because ISIS was, the way ISIS was being dealt with was sort of formalized by that time. And you can see this is from, well, now. So you can see the gray area is ISIS, which has shrunk tremendously. Red is the Syrian government, basically. And the green at the top is various other rebel groups. And you can see how hot the activity has become there. The red dots represent Russian outposts. Orange dot represent Iranian outposts, and or Iranian-backed Shia militia outposts, and the blue dots are Turkish outposts. Again, not fully accurate, but I think it's pretty close. So these are just two of the things that, two of the methodologies we used to work on these papers for the past 1 year. Of course, the last paper that we have worked on is, as I said, is based on Indian cases, which was, of course, possible because there's just not enough cases to begin with. Of course, there's certain conclusions that we came up with, which included, that a grave need to strengthen India's online policing mechanisms of how are you going to collect intelligence online, how are you going to, because a lot of these cases that were flagged to the Indian authorities, I think in Hyderabad, in Bangalore, actually came from nudges being given by foreign intelligences. So it was not the Indian authorities or the Indian police that came up and found these radical elements online, but it was highlighted to them by other agencies. So this is basically a crux of what this monograph deals with. It's a primer first. It deals with South Asia, and it deals with India later on. India's, of course, we tried to make it as data heavy as possible with cases being explained. But as I said, a lot of our initial hypotheses started fading midway because what we were expecting to find was very different to what we actually found, which is a good thing as well. It sort of corrects what notions you had in the beginning and what data doesn't lie. So what data represented was completely different. So I'll just leave it at that point, and we can go to the panel.
Thank you very much, Kabir. And before we go to the panel, can we formally, sort of launch this and for our cameras?
Pick it up. Okay.
And now, as I said, we have an excellent panel, set of panelists here with us. I'll start with Ambassador Fabian, who has had a long experience dealing with Middle Eastern issues, West Asian issues. I would request him to discuss the monograph or anything else around the theme that he wants to say.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair, author, distinguished panelists, ladies and gentlemen. Very privileged to be here, and I should confess I never expected a house full to discuss ISIS. And that too, I mean, a variety, you know. Now, I have had the pleasure of going through the monograph because I got it through mail. It's an excellent monograph, and when I get a monograph, I look at it from the point of view of facts, whether the relevant facts are there. Well, the facts are there, and how they are presented. And I have a problem with, I don't know Arabic, so I have a problem with names. And I should say that a rather complex theme has been sort of presented in a reader-friendly manner. Thank you for that. And I also look at the structure, you know, how it is structured. Another thing I noticed is, you know, I look at it from the point of view of reasoning. Now, in this case, I was happy to see that Kabir doesn't quote scholars ad nauseum. Sometimes in India, especially among well, not only young, but also older scholars, it happens. You know, they quote from here and there, and one doesn't know what does the author think. I have even come across PhD thesis where you don't know what the author thinks. You know, also there is no undue dependence on what I call American or Western scholarship, because I have a theory, and that is that decolonization comes in 3 stages: political, economic, and intellectual. Politically, we are decolonized. Economically, we are getting decolonized. But intellectually, well, it has started, thank God, but you know, we have a much more way to go. But that apart, now, a few comments. There is a tendency to see IS, Islamic State, through the prism of terrorism. And, well, they are terrorists, but that is only one of the prisms. There is much more to it. And I would prefer to look at it as you know, what has emerged, one of the many things which have emerged from the encounter between Islam and Indovana region and the West. Let's look at the standard version. USSR invaded Afghanistan in December 1979. United States, KSA, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan and others supported and motivated Osama bin Laden. Then Sarkawi came there. Well, he got about $5,000 from bin Laden to start his network. And of course, Kabir has referred to the mention made by Pavel in the famous or infamous Security Council speech. And of course, the author asked the question, was it faulty intelligence or was it deliberate? Well, my view, I could be wrong, it was fabricated intelligence, nothing else. Of course, poor Pavel himself did not know it, but that was that. Now, I find a certain flow in IR reasoning in general. Let me try to explain it. You know, if you look at Afghanistan, they never ask why Afghanistan had to be liberated. They start with the occupation by USSR and the liberation. they seldom ask why it had to be liberated. And we all know the story. We know that Brzezinski, the National Security Advisor to President Carter, he comes from Poland. He was keen to get the Soviet military embroiled in Afghanistan so that it will not be able to pay much attention to Eastern Europe, so that, Eastern Europe can be liberated. In fact, months before the Soviet troops entered Afghanistan, the special forces were operating. And 24th of December 1979, Brzezinski sent a message to his president, "Congratulations, we are now in a position to give them their Vietnam." Of course, Soviets were fooled into getting into it. That is a different matter. So, that reminds me of Blaise Pascal, French mathematician come philosopher. 1669, his book Pensées, Thoughts, came out, and he said, one of the many things, Cleopatra's nose, had it been shorter, the whole face of the earth would have been different. Well, what I want to say is that if Brzezinski had not done what he did, the course of history would have been different, and we might not have been sitting here discussing IS. There's always a cause and effect chain from the past to the present. Now, another point I want to make is that IS is only one instance of violent jihadism. So we have to look at the origins of violent jihadism. And, well, again, the standard explanation is Ibn Taymiyyah, Wahhab, Qutb, Sayyid Qutb, the Islamic thinkers who have advocated a certain course of action. Yes, that's important. That's part of the explanation. But let's look at some other explanations also, because in history, there is nothing which has got a single explanation. Explanations are always complex. Now, one, to my mind, is the absence of democracy in the Arab region or in that part of the world, because I want to include Iran also. That is one of the reasons. Now, why is it that there is no democracy? Well, great pundits have said, Fukuyama, Huntington, Bernard Lewis, that Islam and democracy are not compatible. And that has influenced state policy. And that made it easier for the West to prop up dictators. But let's look at it deeper. We all know about what happened in Iran in 1953, Mossadegh. CIA spent $10,000 to arrange for that. Now, what is less well known is that in 1881, Egypt was progressing towards constitutional monarchy. There was Colonel Ahmad Urabi. He was he started an agitation. He went and had an argument with the ruler, and the ruler agreed to a constitutional monarchy. But then what happened? The British and the French, they didn't want it because they had given a lot of money to the ruler and they were not sure they will get the money back. So they took action, and the Egyptian move towards constitutional monarchy was stopped. And as we know, US has supported the post-Nasser dictators in Egypt. Now, I want to come to Mosul because that was very important and you have covered it, June 2014. Let's look at the reason for the fall of Mosul. After all, 1,500, maybe 2,000 fighters on one side, 30,000 soldiers and about 30,000 federal policemen on the other side. And fighting lasted 6 days, 1 week. How come that 1,500 or 2,000 people were able to make these people run away? Well, one reason is that the soldiers were mainly Shia, if not all. And they were in a Sunni region, and they were very unpopular. And they also told themselves, look, why should we bother to defend these people? They don't like us. So that is one of the reasons. But the major reason is that the United States permitted it. United States could have prevented it, but the United States permitted it. Why? Well, when IS was getting formed, when they were getting territory in Syria, the defense intelligence, US, came to the conclusion, oh, that's a strategic asset for us. We can use that against Bashar al-Assad. And, a lot of stuff has come out. Judicial Watch, they have brought out all that, So US could have prevented it. And then, again, if you notice, they took over Mosul, then they started killing people, Christians and one or two other ethnicities. US did nothing. Only when Erbil was threatened, Erbil, where US has a strong presence, commercial, oil and all that sort of thing, then the US got active. And when it was happening, what did the US say? That, they said it's a matter of deep concern. All Iraqis should get together and fight the common foe and all that. Because they were putting pressure on Maliki, the prime minister. 6 weeks or so after the election, he had not formed the government, you see. So, if IS arose, it's one of the prime reasons is US action or inaction, deliberate. Another, of course, is Turkey. Turkey was the transit point, not for everyone. We don't know how many foreign fighters came, but one US estimate is 40,000. But then there are other estimates, 30,000, 27,000. It's very difficult to get accurate estimates. Now, good many of them passed through Turkey. So it was not only the transit point, it was also the transportation point for them to buy stuff and all that sort of thing. And for a long time, Turkey, Erdogan, permitted it, encouraged it. He bought oil from them and all that. So these two countries, they have a certain responsibility. Now, I like the last chapter on South Asia. It gives many facts which are not that well known. I just wanted to ask a question about de-radicalization, because in the West, they are doing it, depending on the country, they are doing it in different ways. Especially in Scandinavia, they're a little soft. That is, if you come back, you can get a job, they sort of watch you, whereas in UK or somewhere else, you may be put in prison and all that sort of thing. So what is happening? That would have been interesting. And, well, it was said, why did so many people go there? From 100 countries, young people went there. 100 countries. Why did they go? Well, to my mind, they were brainwashed. But that is my way of looking at it. But some of them were genuinely looking for a utopia, a perfect society. I mean, through their eyes, not mine. They thought, it was perfect society, So there we are, and I have a question, and that is that I had read somewhere that South Asians were not treated very well, in the sense that they were not put on fighting duty. They were asked to do clerical or other things, not so clerical also, menial also. So is that true or not? But on the whole, let me say that It's an excellent monograph, and since this, what you call the phenomenon, well, philosophically speaking, if you make a distinction between phenomenon and noumenon, noumenon is more real. Phenomenon is a little less real. Well, this is something in between, because though they have lost territory, they are very much there. They can carry out attacks, because it's a mindset. Above all, it's mindset. So I stop here, and thank you so much, and congratulations again.
Let me invite Ajay now for his comments. Ajay Sahani is Executive Director, Institute of Conflict Management, and he also runs a very, very popular and very useful South Asia Terrorism portal. Ajay, floor is all yours.
Okay. I'd also like to congratulate you for an excellent effort. We need documentation first and above everything else. And there is a tremendous dearth of documentation, not only of this issue, but I think broadly of almost all Islamist terrorism and of all the aspects of armed violence, not only in India, but across the world. In that sense, this is an enormous and important contribution. A great deal of very significant historical narrative has been recorded here. And in some measure, I would like to start with what Ambassador Fabian also emphasized, that ISIS is not, to my mind, he used different words, of course, but to my mind, so unique. There are so many other groupings. You do make many, many references, but I find that there is, in some measure, especially in assessment, a certain measure of incoherence in the volume. And this incoherence is not unique. It's not yours. It is an incoherence of approach that afflicts almost all writing across the world on ISIS. ISIS was treated as if it was an unprecedented phenomenon, and a phenomenon that would never again be repeated, a phenomenon that had changed the entire trajectory and horizon of terrorism across the world in ways that no other movement had and no other movement would. And overwhelmingly, it was projected as a movement of terrorism, whereas I think you make this, you see, this is the important thing in this volume, that in terms of facts, in terms of historical narrative, you do tend to cover almost all that is relevant. What you draw out of that historical narrative reflects, to my mind, a widespread bias. You did mention when you were speaking in the beginning that a lot of what you started with was emotive. It was based on sentiment or emotion or expectations, probably influenced by the kind of horror and fear that the ISIS provoked in most of our minds. But then you found that a lot of that wasn't the case. Nevertheless, I do find that in your assessment, a lot of that is retained. And that is reflecting trends across the world. And I'm going to go across a few of these. First of all, you say that the ISIS, though disturbing, was unique. Now, there are a lot of these sweeping statements in this. I will disagree with you in an assessment. That's not a problem. But the problem is that you don't tell me how it's unique. There is another thing, that so many experts, commentators had invested enormously in the magnitude of what the ISIS represented. And I find a reluctance to give up on the ISIS. I feel that the disappointment in the strategic community in the ISIS's failure is almost as great as would be the disappointment possibly in the ISIS leadership. We're not willing to accept or admit that this thing has been beaten. And I see this recurrent in global commentary. First of all, this was never as big as it was made out to be. It was never as big as it was made out. And I said this in July, August 2014. Ambassador Fabian mentioned how Mosul was taken. There was not a single major victory that was achieved by the ISIS in frontal and determined confrontation with an adversarial force. Ambassador Fabian again talked about how a lot of this was permitted. For almost a year, more than a year, no, almost 2 years, you had convoys of petroleum and petroleum products moving from ISIS territory. You mentioned again, Syria itself was buying oil. Syria itself was paying for electricity, which was being transmitted out of ISIS-controlled territory. It was only when Russia entered the equation that suddenly those convoys disappeared because they bombed, excuse my language, but the crap out of them. They were not invisible. Everyone saw them. It was a collusive, and for whatever reasons, Turkey was involved. Turkey was, Erdogan's family is said to have been the principal beneficiary of this whole illegal trade. We were buying that oil, by the way. So all these factors, and I don't see them. You do use a very nice line somewhere where you say that, Zarqawi was not his own, or was it Baghdadi was not his own man? He was the product of Saddam Hussein, he was the product of it. But then when you start talking of the ISIS, you talk as if it has entirely its own agency, as if it was this enormously powerful phenomenon. And you again mention, as I say, that, well, most of ISIS was the Ba'ath Party and Saddam's dismantled armies. You don't follow through on these, and that is problematic to me. We keep on talking again and again about how the ideology has survived. Again, we will disagree on assessments. But what is this unique ideology? Nowhere do you tell me that this is what distinguishes the ideology of ISIS from the ideology of, say, Al-Qaeda, or of the Pakistani state, or of the Saudi state. And I'm sure there are distinctions, but I don't see them here. And this is, the ideology has survived very interestingly, You say, why, you say ISIS 2.0 is coming. Why is this ISIS 2.0? Why is it not the rump element of the defeated ISIS 1.0? It may be ISIS 2.0, but then you have to prove to me that this is something tremendous and terrible that is going to overwhelm and overcome us very, very quickly. The post-geography era of the group, I quote you, offers a bigger challenge than that which can be defeated by military operations against a semi-defined proto-state. Bigger challenge? Seriously? You think the ISIS today is a bigger challenge than it was in 2014, 15, 16? Both in terms of its terrorist impact and its terrorist potential. And, of course, its territorial threat and dominance. All kinds of capacities have diminished. The ISIS decline is not only a loss of territory. It is a loss of capacity. It is a loss of revenues. It is a loss of moral influence. Nothing discredits a formation, any kind of grouping, institution, individual, as much as defeat does. You defeat a formation, everything else fragments. And yet you keep on insisting the ideology will survive. It's going to be a bigger threat in future. And I just see the same thing, the reluctance to admit that this is a defeated group. At one point of time, you talk about how, the Bangladesh incident, the Holy Bakery incident, and the Rohingyas, and the radicalization in Bangladesh. What are we talking about? Are we talking about the Rohingyas? Are we talking about the general issue of radicalization in Bangladesh? Or are we talking about ISIS, its potential and impact in Bangladesh? What was the ISIS potential and impact in Bangladesh? Holy Bakery, a couple of other small incidents. The Naib Khalifa, who was a Canadian resident, brought into Syria, sent to Bangladesh, survived 2.5 months after he landed there, and that was the end of the group. He was shot, finished. That was 2016. We are in 2018. Where is the manifestation of ISIS in Bangladesh? And you somewhere use this phrase where you say Afghanistan and ISIS in Afghanistan and Bangladesh, first of all, no comparison of scale, constitute a grave threat to the stability of this region. How does ISIS in Bangladesh constitute a grave threat to the stability of the region? I completely fail to comprehend any kind of... you give almost no narrative of what the Bangladesh state has achieved against radicalization over the last 8-9 years now. We will disagree again. You may still come to the conclusion that this is a potentially volatile state, all sorts of things, but you may conclude. You cannot merely assert. And the difference between a conclusion and an assertion, between an expression of opinion and assessment, is that the conclusion or assertion derives from the facts as stated, not as known by you. I mean, I'm sure you have your own arguments, but I don't see them here. And those arguments must come out again and again. You know, language, the repeated marketing of the narrative of the loss of territory by ISIS. It's not a narrative, it is a fact. By using language like this, you seem to... Victory is in inverted commas. Do you think no victory has been achieved against the ISIS? Again, you may say there is other potential, it will arise, all sorts of things. Whatever has been applied is a band-aid solution. Puppet systems of government are being set up. Puppet systems of government existed there before this whole nonsense started. It is not just in... All external powers want nothing but puppet systems over there. At some stage, you also talk about Iraq being more stable than Syria because you have the destabilizing influence of Russia in Syria. How is the Russian influence destabilizing? It was the American and the European and the Western influence that has set fire to this entire region. Again, you will disagree with me perhaps in your assessment, and you may very right, be completely right. Russia is a destabilizing factor, possibly. But then you must tell me how, why. Why is Russia destabilizing? And why is the lunacy of American policy over the last 15, 16 years somehow desirable, somehow better than this terrible Russian invasion of these regions? So arguments must be brought out from the facts as stated, not from implicit ideas. Here, this is, I think, the most important element that I would like to emphasize, that the whole logic of state intervention, not only in Iraq, Syria, but in Afghanistan, as Ambassador Fabian said, across the world, the constant destabilizing elements of state intervention, whether it was so-called, to support a democratic, nothing, by the way, in Western action, actually can, on the evidence of it all, be seen to be a rightful intervention for the purposes declared. The actions are not consistent with the Arab Spring, and the support to the Arab Spring was not an intention to bring democracy to these areas because they were using completely undemocratic means and forces for regime change. We have a very clear documentation of the fact that the idea of regime change in some 6 states of West Asia was something that had already been conceptualized and was being brought about in phases. This is again a set of assertions. These are analyses that these 6 states are going to be destabilized irrespective. Regime change is going to, and Iran is among them. And therefore we see today, despite regime changes in America, the objective of regime changes in West Asia remains consistent across Republican and Democratic regimes. Again, we may disagree on the outcomes or on the assessments, but you cannot talk about ISIS, the phenomenon ISIS, the potential of ISIS, without addressing these critical issues. Now, where is ISIS? Is ISIS only in West Asia? I see no mention, almost or little or no mention of ISIS in Africa. Why is ISIS in Africa not important? Why are, for instance, I always come to this little example when the Charlie Hebdo killings occurred. Was it 12 fatalities, if I remember correctly? The whole world came out. We also came out into the streets and we said, we are Charlie Hebdo. In exactly the same period, the 2 days preceding and the day of the Charlie Hebdo strike, there was this massacre in Baga where I believe something like 2,000 odd people were slaughtered. Most people haven't even heard of Baga. And so we must understand what, we talked about the decolonization of the minds, intellectual decolonization, but I'm afraid our minds are enormously and overwhelmingly colonized even today, because we accept our narrative almost entirely from the West. And therefore Russia is a villain and America, irrespective of the colossal harm it has visibly done, is the virtuous state. And therefore 12 white people killed in France are obviously a greater crisis for the world and a threat to world security than 2,000 odd sorry black people. I mean, black people are meant to die. They're basically an inferior race. I suppose brown people are somewhere in the middle. India again. You reiterate again the potential, though you also talk about countervailing factors. You are very, very right. Why would anybody want to go to get ISIS help when Pakistan is right next door? You speak of the India-Pakistan quagmire, which has a very strong dynamic that will keep the ISIS out. And yet you constantly go back. You talk about the, if I remember, social and political context that creates and sustains the potential for the revival of the ISIS or a escalation of the threat of the ISIS in India. Is the resistance of Indian Muslims to radicalization over the last several decades, if I may say so, but certainly over in the post 9/11 period where this has all come to a head, is the resistance of the Indian Muslim to radicalization not part of your political and social context within which this threat should be evaluated? Should we not give some space to the initiatives that have helped, despite no real or coherent de-radicalization policy or program within government, that have kept the Muslim in this country? And here again, I find this a peculiar sense of disappointment, which in some ways echoes our friend from what is now the Al-Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent, 2014. He wrote this rather plaintive piece, also on video, Omar, why is there no storm in your seas? And that seems to be what so many strategic experts in India are doing today. Ye Hindustan ke Musalmanon ko bimari kya hai? Ye kyun nahi aag laga rahe hain yahan pe? That is not how we should be. We should raise an alarm where there is a manifest threat, or even an implicit threat, but an implicit threat demonstrated on the basis of visible indices. You say somewhere, the threat of ISIS cannot be quantified. If the threat of ISIS cannot be quantified, then it is a prejudice of your mind, nothing more. It is not a threat. It may not be directly quantifiable. We cannot say there are so many ISIS people. I was part of a conference in 2015, early 2015, where some good gentleman got up and said 374 Indians have gone to join the ISIS. And for every one that we know, there are at least another 10 who have gone. So there are 3,740. And then there are tens of thousands of sympathizers. Where do you get these numbers from? At that juncture, I had not seen anything comparable to these numbers in any source, credible or otherwise. And yet, we were running around flapping our dhotis in terror because the ISIS was coming, the ISIS was coming. And now that the ISIS is not coming, we are still saying, they may not come, but their ideas will come. What are their ideas? How are they different from the Al-Qaeda's ideas? How are they different from the ideas of the Pakistani state? How are they different manifestly from Abu Ala Mawdudi's ideas or Sayyid Qutb's ideas? What is the ideology of ISIS that you fear? And you clearly fear it. That they cut people's heads off? We've been cutting people's heads off for decades, centuries. The Maoists cut people's heads off. Children cut people's heads off. There was a video, I think, of 2007-8 in Swat of a 12-year-old boy beheading a prisoner. The only thing truly unique about the ISIS was the quality of and the scale of their exploitation of the media. That you bring out reasonably well. And that's important. But that's like saying they used a gun better. I have a gun, you have a gun, you have better aim. That's about all. It's not an ideological or a strategic difference. In terms of strategy, I do not see a single thing that was very particularly different. In terms of tactics, yes, they used this to terrorize not just their immediate targets, but the entire world, and very successfully. And this is something that is very, very important to me, and I will conclude with this last little point. That nowhere do you examine the degree to which ISIS excesses crystallized into a response from a very reluctant, till then, Muslim world to confront the reality of terrorism. The degree to which the Muslim world today is speaking out against terrorism is the only truly unprecedented feature in all that the ISIS has brought about. Today you have at least talk of religious and administrative and legal reform in Saudi Arabia, which was one of the most intransigent states. Where it will go is still to be seen, but this is a consequence of the ISIS phenomenon. You speak of ISIS as if it can just revive itself. Oh, the vacuums that are still there in Iraq and Syria give ISIS the opportunity to revive itself. There may be other, a lot of this sounds like someone who's complaining that, okay, you may have cured my cancer, but I still get the flu from time to time. The cancer has been cured. Now what we are dealing with is an infinitely lesser threat from this group. Are there other threats? Is there inequality in the world? Is there injustice in the world? Can other patterns of violence come out? Can other groups come out? You are here to assess ISIS. Don't conflate. Don't make the Rohingyas and the ISIS and radicalization in Bangladesh all meld into one paralyzing sense of threat and fear. I tend to be a little harsh, but in my language and my words, but that's how I speak and that's how I write. Nevertheless, a very, very significant issue because nobody else is actually bringing these materials together. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And now can I request Praveen? Praveen, of course, we all know Praveen from his writings. He's a prolific writer on strategic affairs. And And I think now he's the group consulting editor for Network 18. Yes.
Thank you so much for having me here, Harsh and Kabir. Congratulations. It's really nice we're having a debate about this. That's the first thing. I'm tired of these Delhi events where everyone politely agrees with each other. And I hope there'll be some further elaboration on some of these themes. I just wanted to say the Saudis, for all their nice words, are still going around being very nice and friendly to Al-Qaeda in Yemen and elsewhere. So the world doesn't change. But I'll try and come to some of these issues from a slightly different angle. And I want to zone in on what's been happening in India. This is a fantastic, I think, empirical effort. And there's lots of stuff to think about here. But I also think there are some larger issues that maybe are raised by this text and that we ought to talk to them. I see other people in this room who work on some of these issues. And the first builds on something Ajay mentioned, which is why are we talking about ISIS at all? What is its significance when it comes to India? I'm not going to talk about the Middle East or anywhere else. But what is its actual significance? I think one of the things that, Ajay asked what is the threat? And I think for some of us at least, one of the worries is that we have an appalling record of actually assessing or estimating threats before they blow up under our chair. In 1988, the local station of the Intelligence Bureau was completely convinced nothing was going on in Kashmir. On the eve of the Kargil war, we had an army that was greatly improving its golfing skills. We've had a number of instances of this kind. Yes, absolutely. Building a zoo in Leh, if I remember correctly. So these wonderful things have happened. We've been bad at understanding what's actually going on. And hence the concern. Is this something that is about to blow up in our faces that we're not paying attention to? And I think that's a fair enough question. But with jihadi movements, this is slightly complicated. We've had a long history of groups doing what ISIS, or people calling themselves ISIS, are now attempting to do in India. 95, 96, we had the Hizbul Mujahideen trying to set off bombs in various Indian cities, trying to create pan-India networks. We had the LET, the JEM, the Kashmir Islamic Front, various other people doing it from 98, 99. We, of course, had the Indian Mujahideen in more recent memory. And all of these groups have had success in drawing certain numbers of people. The Indian Mujahideen actually drew far larger numbers than ISIS has done. And they've all come to a pretty similar, been driven by a very similar conclusion, which is eminently logical, that look, you can keep on fighting insurgencies in the periphery or doing whatever you're doing in Kashmir or anywhere else. But till you make this hurt India and the Indian state, you're not going to get anywhere. You're not going to be able to extract any conceivable concessions. But I think this point is important to bear, that the ISIS phenomenon isn't really new. And if there's anything striking about ISIS, it is the fact that it has been so utterly unsuccessful in actually staging terrorist operations. That may change if some people who went abroad have survived what's happened and if they come back. But at the moment, these have been almost amateur attempts. And to come back to something Ajay mentioned about the scale of support for ISISism, if you like, or jihadism, and no one has an answer. I can give you any opinion I like at all. We have no empirical estimation of this. But one of the things that interests me in the case studies Kabir's come at is precisely this despite this casualness, almost anyone who's decided to set up an ISIS cell somewhere has managed to convince his, best friend and the guy he hangs around at the local pawn shop and two other idiots, and it's quite a substantial bunch of people in some cases, to join into these fairly harebrained and amateurish efforts. And that suggests to me that at least amongst certain cohorts of young people, there is a sympathy for this kind of adventure. Now, why this sympathy is there? Is it simply adventure seeking? Is it deeply ideological? Is it driven by political resentment? Is it, what is it? We don't know. We just don't know. And that's probably something that scholars should be researching as we speak. Having said that, in Kashmir, 25 years into an insurgency, we still have absolutely no idea who the insurgents are. So you can say anything you like. They're highly educated, they're badly educated, they're urban, they're rural, they're peasants, they're whatever. You can say anything you like and no one can challenge you, because in this great and wonderful system we have, nobody's actually done the numbers. The second thing I'd flag is, coming back to this political causes, the jihadi movement has, or jihadism has a far longer and deeper history in India than people tend to acknowledge, and is in fact a well-respected part of, if you like, the cultural tradition in several parts of the country. So you have jihadist warfare by self-described jihadis in the Malabar coast in the 16th century, resisting Portuguese colonialism and the Portuguese savage war on the what was until then the Muslim monopoly of the spice rate troops. In the 18th, 19th century, Sayyid Ahmad Barelvi, others, 1857 in this city, you have various numbers of self-described jihadis, and stretching on into the 20th century. And this is why I'm sometimes a little skeptical of the idea something fundamentally new is happening in our country that is radically a departure from the past, because all of these movements have attracted fairly substantial numbers of people. Long before there was the internet, 1921, 22, the Hijrat movement, 22. So you have thousands of people tramping across the Khyber Pass, imagining that they will set up an Islamic State under King Amanullah, and of course getting pillaged and looted and killed on the way, because the local Pashtun tribes took a entrepreneurial attitude to this pilgrimage. Lots of nice Biharis coming, carrying their family jewels. So the inevitable happened. But you had tens of thousands of people actually attempting this pedestrian journey across the Khyber Pass, all the way from Bihar and Uttar Pradesh, in pursuit of a millenarian dream, the Islamic State. This is not new in this country's history. And again, compared to some of these movements, these so-called radical new movements have actually attracted smaller numbers of followers. And I'll come back to that and maybe look at why. And the third thing I think here it's maybe important to look at is why have these groups been so unsuccessful? Well, we've alluded, I think, in this report to one reason, which is, of course, Pakistan. But that just raises another question. Pakistan backs the Indian Mujahideen and its various sort of fringe elements and the LET in staging strikes against India, quite steadily till 2611 and after. But over the last 4 or 5 years, we haven't had an attack. And many of the people who went to the Islamic State are guys who were fed up because the ISI wasn't letting them do what they wanted to do. And they were basically being made to sit in one place in Karachi and behave themselves, and they got fed up by it. They felt betrayed by the ISI. Why has this happened? What brought about this change? Is it American pressure? Is it the threat of crisis erupting with India, which the Pakistan army doesn't want? What is it? We don't know. We have absolutely no idea. Again, sometimes when we think about the course of this India-Pakistan thing, we sometimes are a little reductive in looking at what is actually happening. And I think this whole situation is somewhat more fluid than we sometimes think. So what is going on? Coming back to the internet, there's a lot of that in there, and I'd like to question the idea that this is, of course, at all something that we ought greet with the kind of concern that we do. So I spoke a little bit ago about the Hijrat movement, but even if you look at late 20th century movements like the Ram Janambhoomi movement over Ayodhya, if you look at the mobilization of communal riots in the 1980s and 1970s, you had mass violence across very large parts of the country, spurred on only by rumor and very little else, and where elaborate and sophisticated mobilization involving hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of people was possible without this kind of infrastructure. Is the internet really driving a kind of radicalization that is unprecedented or new? I don't know. I'm not sure that you need an empirical matrix for this. but you certainly need a testability. I mean, the one thing I've seen in the literature constantly is, say, the Muzaffarnagar violence. And by the standards of all India communal violence, this is pretty, I hate to say this, but small peas. By the standards of our riots, it was not very big. It was contained relatively rapidly. I think this whole sort of thing with Facebook and WhatsApp and so on has regrettably seduced many people in our government, precisely because it gives the illusion that by turning off some internet server somewhere or reducing the encryption on a key, you can save yourself the hard work of actually going out and doing policing, which is, catching people doing illegal acts. And it's a lot nicer to sit around in a room like this with lots of terminals with flashy lights than hang around in some horrible Uttar Pradesh town, trying to stop things from happening. And I think, as in the realm of scholarship, we should beware this also. There's a seduction to some of this which is a problem. So what does the ISIS story really tell us again? So we had a whole bunch of people from across the world, possibly in unprecedented numbers, showing up in a region in which the state had collapsed because of civil tensions, where the military had ceased to function. And for a period of time, until the authority of the state was reasserted, this became a magnet for all kinds of crazy people doing crazy things. Is there really a lesson there? That's the lesson of Afghanistan, of Bosnia, of Chechnya, Kashmir at one point in time. The MLC for Bandipora, Usman Majid, who I think Khalid knows, he used to joke that he wasn't a legislator only for Bandipora, but for the entire Islamic world. Because he used to take you around this tour of graveyards and say, Chechnya, Afghanistan, Somalia. He says, my constituents are from everywhere. This was true for a time. And as long as we have these parts of the world where the state collapses, radical movements of one form or another, not necessarily jihadist either, will take them over. Mexico is a classic case where an entropic state has been taken over by various kinds of narco syndicates. Africa, you alluded to, you've had all kinds of movements, not just jihadist again, where states are unable to sustain themselves efficiently. This will happen. It has happened for great lengths of time. It will continue to happen. And so the challenge seems to be precisely what it has always been, which is maintaining robust state structures where the rule of law persists. And this is where I think the threat Kabir has flagged could perhaps be productively explored a little bit more and a little less politely. What do we know about Indian jihadist movements? I said they've been there since the 16th century. But there's one unifying thread. They erupt at times of political crisis for the Muslim community. And they are not the only response. There are a variety of political responses. The jihadist response has always been a relatively peripheral one to other kinds of things. So Syed Ahmad wasn't the only one. Syed Ahmad Barelvi wasn't the only one concerned with the decline of Mughal power. Not at all. It happens to all of us. Wasn't the only one concerned with the decline of Mughal power. There were a great variety of other Muslim thinkers and so on and so forth. It's just he became relevant for a particular movement or tendency. And we are at a juncture where this is important. So everyone has, I think in this room would agree that the exceptional feature of this story is the lack of response from Indian Muslims in trying and testing times to this movement. Why is that? And to my mind anyway, the one story that needs exploration is that almost all of these kids who have gone or who have been documented in Kabir's study are members of what you might call a new middle class. Now, India, as all of you know, lost its Muslim middle class such as it was at the time of partition. Bureaucrats, leaders in the community largely went to Pakistan in search of opportunities there. But over the last couple of decades, especially with liberalization, you have seen the genesis, if you like, of a new Muslim middle class. Kids who, for the first time, are enjoying some economic opportunity, some educational opportunity, but are also confronting the problems that go with it. So, if I may put this crudely, it's great to have a degree from an engineering college somewhere and get a job in Wipro. But then when you try renting an apartment in Noida, you find that's not so easy. You want to break into the middle class, but you can't quite. And a whole set of new frictions and tensions erupt. And this is happening precisely at a time where the traditional political leadership of Muslim communities across India is collapsing. There is none for the most part, and nothing new has emerged. And when you look at jihadist narratives of what is going on, they sense opportunity. They sense very specific kinds of opportunity in this. Because almost all of their polemic is saying that, look, your leaders have failed you. These clerics have failed you. Deoband are a bunch of jokers. Don't waste your time with these people. Go down this path. They haven't had success in my estimation because this new emerging cohort of Muslims still believes that there is possibility within this system. And that there's absolutely nothing to be had from the jihadist path. But in some parts of the country, we've seen that fray, like in Kashmir, where an entire generation of young urban people has started seeing this differently. And in places like Kerala, I wouldn't be quite as sanguine about the durability of our democratic consensus. I think there is a possibility, not a huge one, but a possibility, that things could conceivably head in an unpleasant direction. Like I said, when I started, the one thing that fascinates me with all of the cases Kabir has put together is that one idiot decides to do something and 20 idiots are willing to follow, incompetently and so on. So, all in all, this is a great starting point, and I really hope, precisely because of the paucity of work like this, that you, others at ORF and other scholars will be working more on this. Because as far as I can see, none of the questions that we need to be asking ourselves about jihadist movements in this country have really been researched or begun to be answered. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Praveen. And I think I would concur with how we ended, saying that a lot of this is about starting a conversation on a subject which seemed to have been outside the periphery. And I'm sorry, but I think, Praveen, journalists are not doing enough, and in fact, often providing us very, very dangerous, ideas about.
I couldn't agree more.
Yeah, so I think it's in a sense, this is the beginning of that conversation which we need to have amongst our intelligence. Even academics are not doing enough. For example, Indian academics are completely outside this debate, which is very unfortunate. So I think I hope this will be a starting point. I'll give Kabir the last word on this, but I'll open this up now for your questions, comments, observations. We have, I think, a very last few minutes remaining for time. Yes.
I think it's a wonderful effort. And we've had some super critiques, actual super critiques, but it's a wonderful effort. I don't want to talk about the phenomena. I want to talk about reality. Your first slide, fall of ICS and implications for South Asia. I'm more concerned with India. Actually, I want to understand, when did ISI rise in India? We are now talking of the fall. So in my view, there is not that much of an impact as far as the fall is concerned, unless you can make me understand it more. Yes, in our neighborhood, Afghanistan, which has been talked about, I'm not too sure about Pakistan, but in India, we've had the threats that have been brought out, Lashkar-e-Toiba, Jaish-e-Mohammed, etc., homegrown terrorists. But not much of this, and the data you've given, my data was 10, 20, 80, 300 and something. But we have been more influenced, which I've written here, by the Western media. They have sold us the idea that the ISIS was very well organized, it was very well structured, it had economic assets, it was selling oil over the world. So that was the overbearing ideas in our mind, and not what, I've been looking at ISIS informally. Where was all this being done by ISIS in India? South Asia maybe, and the other. So you might like to, so my threat finally is these groups coming from Pakistan, our homegrown groups. The idea of ISIS, radicalization, is a threat. Thank you, Chair.
Kabir, one question. How assiduously did the ISIS actually try to recruit in India? We know they made efforts, but how focused was the effort, how much were they trying? Because there was a time when we were hearing that because India, Pakistan, Bangladesh is about what, 40% of the total Muslim population, maybe even more. Uh, this was the new growth area. So I just wanted to know, one thing was that. Uh, the other thing is on rumors. You're right. We were all trying to feed the Ganesh Murthy's milk, and
Millions of people.
millions of people, hundreds of millions of people. I tried it myself because I wanted to. Honestly, I wanted to see what the hell this is all about. But it was actually happening until some rationalist explained why it was happening. But the point is that all over India there's a milk shortage, right? But I think the only difference now, and that was an era when there was none of the mobile phones, nothing. But I wonder with the new communication tools, perhaps rumors can travel much wider, much faster, although the milk incident actually kind of squares it all up. But I just wonder maybe that is where the fear starts coming from. But your point otherwise is well taken, that you shut the internet and you think you've solved the problem. And you haven't solved the problem. Um, the third thing is on this whole business about the course of history being different if the nose had been shorter or longer. The point is that maybe the course of history might have been different because the ISIS was a very well organized uh, organization. The way they set themselves up, maybe they made a few strategic errors in the sense that they were just too in your face. They were not concentrating only on Iraq and the other tottering states around them. They tried to target the Europeans and the Americans, and they thought that just by jihad will make them win the world. That was not to be. But that doesn't mean that the problem is not there. And I agree with what Ajay is saying, and I've been one fellow who's always been saying this. What's the difference between the ISIS, the Taliban, the Al Qaeda, the Lashkar-e-Taiba, the ISI, any of these guys? They have done precisely the same things which these guys are doing. But that ideological continuum which ties all these guys up is something that we cannot be sanguine about. We cannot pretend that there is something unique about India which will protect us all the time. Although there is something unique, because all those millenarian movements, Praveen, you talk about, uh, while these were in that day and age when Shah Waliullah or Sayyid Ahmad Barelvi were coming out with their movements. These were radically new ideas they were throwing up. They were very old ideas, but packaged in a new this thing. And they attracted a lot of young people who made a beeline to that. But there was also an established order which resisted it. Within the Muslim community, within the ulema, who treated them as almost like takfiris, right? In fact, they call them takfiris. So the point is that that phenomena still exists in India. We are seeing that pushback. But the point is that the whole idea of terrorism is it's not necessary that the whole community is going to get taken in by it. But even if a 0.05% of almost 200 million strong community gets taken in by it, you are in a deep mess. So we can't afford to be sanguine about it. We have to be careful about it, but we don't need to be alarmist about it.
Hello. Yeah. Hi. Sanan here from RSI Singapore. Just a few observations, and maybe that can translate into questions. First of all, I'd gone through your pieces as you had released them throughout the last few months and so on. I believe that when we mentioned the IS strength is that, or it was exaggerated to a large extent by Western countries saying that they're present all over the world and stuff. I think a lot of country governments tend to forget that these IS generally taps into existing networks. So, for example, Abu Sayyaf group is already existing in the Philippines. That's where they get their strength from. And this happens in a lot of places. Now, with India, at least in my observation, that is much less. The scope for that is much lesser. Maybe that's one observation that I had. The second is that the family and the societal structure of the way the Muslim community is set, because I come from South India. I've been in Bangalore, and the structure there is extremely strong in dissuading people from moving towards, joining groups like ISIS. And thirdly, when you mentioned the issue of the Muslim middle class, right? I think what a lot of researchers are not looking into is also the existence of counter narratives, because we, the Muslim middle class in India, what we also do is that we are now looking at lots of internet preachers who may not be Salafist in nature, okay, and who are actually providing, not because they are meant to provide counter narratives, but they're just providing counter narratives by virtue of what they say. And that is highly spoken about within the Muslim middle class. Maybe these are some observations that I just wanted to pass on. Thank you. Yes. Okay.
I'm Major General Bakshi from the Army. We have been talking on the whole evening and even otherwise. There's a lack of evident ISIS activity in India. We do say there are one or two good reasons for it. One is we say that India has a comparative harmony and integration of various communities, so that's good. The other is that the police, for whatever it's worth, is doing a reasonable job at the local level in trying to prevent any such violent activity. But the third thing, I will speak from my experience. Right from 1988, we've been in Kashmir. There has never been a local Kashmiri boy who has come as a Fedayeen with a suicide vest. You can correct me if I'm wrong, I've got more colleagues from the army here. Even in Nagaland, even in the LW areas, the local Indian person does not go for a Fedayeen attack. So with all this in mind, yes, the threat is less, as Mr. Sani would like to say, but we cannot take any of all this for granted. This could change in a jiffy. So as academia and as the people in uniform, we have to look at all this very, very closely. But the last element, which was also touched upon by one of the speakers, is the intelligencies. So we do hope they will give us some more warning as compared to what we had earlier, so the army doesn't get launched all of a sudden into an area which we always thought was peaceful. So I'd like to ask, what are we doing to sharpen that part, the intelligence angle?
Just an observation or perhaps a comment, or could serve as a question as well, is that when we talk about terrorism, somehow Salafi Wahhabi has become synonymous to terrorism. And just 10 minutes before coming here, I was reading an article about terror funding, and all it talk about Salafi Wahhabi, and as if saying that this is the only terrorism and this is the only reason for the terrorism. Which again, I believe is a Western way of looking at the problem and not completely understanding the problem, and then also missing out on assessments and perhaps the responses to those threats. Say for instance, Salafi Wahhabi may not be as big a threat as it is in some parts of Middle East, or but the other sects within the Islam may be, or for instance, we completely gloss over the fact that there are Shia terror groups as well. And this, in a sense, is creating a very simplistic and a very narrowed down understanding of terrorism or jihadism per se. And I would like to put it to you, just to put it on record, since we're in the business of starting conversation, this could also serve as a good way of starting a conversation on that as well.
That somehow the Muslim community is not endeared with the idea of Islamic State. This is also a presumption. I want to know from these Islamic studies, is there any study conducted in India to assess the mood of Muslims, or what is their opinion about the ISIS, or general, a kind of, a movement, terrorism, say. Has there been any study, any survey conducted by any authority, any agency, be it even the government of India? to assess the mood of Muslims or their opinion about ISIS, terrorism, or other issues confronting the world. Without that empirical study, I think we are just talking in the air. So even Mr. Sahani was very vocal in disputing many points of the study. He's also talking with some assumption. I mean, it is also not evidence. Even though I may get swayed by his argument, that's a different issue. So this is what I wanted to know. And lastly, I know, because I also some trying to read these things, and I'm also a police officer coming from Kerala border. I have spent about 35 years in the city, and Kerala has been mentioned as one of the largest contributor to the ISIS movement. That is actually right. But what I feel is that, unlike other Muslims in this country, Kerala is one Muslim community which has a very strong and economically and politically very strong middle class, which you may not find, say, in UP, Bihar, or North. Generally, South India Muslim community has a very strong and very, very viable middle class segment of the population. And all that they are not highly educated, people among the Muslims in Kerala, the state has lived for long in their service, and their exposure to the Middle East and all that. So all these things you will find in Muslim, those who have been driven to the ISIS ideology or they have tried to cross over to the ISIS state, somehow have some connection with the Middle East. If I am not wrong, because by the time this became very, known to Kerala, I was retired. This has come in 2014, so retired in 30. So that route is through that. May not be deliberate, and of course, internet and all that is again what Mr. Swami said, Praveen said is very correct. As far as we are making out a big threat out of internet, we may not be. So this is what I wanted to know, especially the survey part of it. And Kerala part of it, you said that the unrest in the Muslim community will come in a context, in a particular juncture. Now, has that juncture arrived, or we are waiting for that juncture, which will sort of drive the Muslim middle class to go against the state?
One last question. So, to Kabir is, what's the incentive for an boy, middle class, young Muslim boy from Kerala to join the ranks of Islamic State and fight? When he's getting education, he has money, he's coming from a landowner family, what's the incentive to join fight for Islamic State in Afghanistan or Iraq?
Okay, with that, the floor is yours to answer your questions, comments.
First of all, thank you, Dr. Sani and Praveen and Ambassador Fabian for your excellent remarks. I've sent this paper around to a lot of other people before it got published, and I got equally strong reactions from almost all sectors. So it's great to see that everyone was so involved in at least going through it by line. And yeah. So basically, one of the first things I remember going to Professor Pant when we started this, we started the initial process, right? So the whole idea of doing this was because no one has done anything on it. And that's a very big task, because just as you said, data is just not there. So you have to do a lot of your own sort of groundwork, and a lot of groundwork happens by not being in the field also, because just how a lot of this stuff goes. But and I remember another point talking with Professor Pant within about 1 month of studying this is I went to him and I said, this is going to be biased. This is going to be biased because a lot of the two reasons. First of all, a lot of things that we are consuming at the moment, whether it be research papers, whether it be articles, is Western based. So it is going to be biased. So the two reasons, of course, is accessibility and language, right? So I don't speak Arabic and I don't speak Russian. So that became completely out of my purview. So I was going to the Brits and I was going to the Americans, and I told him it's going to reflect in this in a major way. And the second thing was, of course, when we started work on this. Other than these issues, just keeping up with what was happening. It was a very fast-paced environment, right? And between two people, we were trying our best to just see what was being released, either both as what was propaganda from the ISIS, how it was being seen by the media, or how it was being seen by various other scholars. It was very hard to just compile all that and come out with informed opinions, right? Fully informed opinions. So you were basically doing with what was possible at that point of time, which reflects in this paper. I think as a writer who was writing it, I could see it was happening, and which was I went to Professor Pant to discuss this as well. So, but thanks for your comments, and I think they were fantastic. And the tracker project is still on, so we are not done with it yet. So we are still studying, and hopefully you will find great improvements in our analysis as the time goes by. Sir, you were talking about the whole the ISIS never rose in India. Yeah, I mean that we've dealt that the rise of ISIS in the primer, so which is from a Middle Eastern perspective. As I said in the beginning, our database is 117, which is not even a thing. It's non-existent, right? So ISIS is non-existent in India, but because it was a globally pushed event, it was an event that everyone was talking about. So we thought it's a good idea to see how it could reflect in India. So if you see the individual cases, there's this very little commonality to anything. It's sporadic. So there is no ISIS in India, but that narrative, or that just the brand was being followed globally. So we thought it's a good idea to see if whatever little reflection of it has landed here, how it looks like. Basically, that's the cusp of what we were trying to do here. I've written the second question. I can't remember who asked it though. But how focused was, I think Sushant asked, how focused was ISIS effort here? It was literally, from what information we have, it could be other things which we don't know, but it was literally just two people. Two people trying their best online to create some sort of ruckus. So they were not even trying to enter the sort of try to infiltrate the community or something like that. They were literally looking for weak examples online that they could exploit on a local level. So even at some point of time, they said, look, we don't want you to come here, or we don't want you to travel. We want you to do something there. So in some cases, they told these people, like, why don't you go by knives? Why don't you go by machetes? These small things that we saw in Europe, for example. They were trying to sort of see if that's possible. Yeah, and of course, they saw that didn't fructify. So there was no concerted effort to it. But the whole point was that even if, at that point, if one such event happened or took place in 2015, when it was at the peak, it would create that sort of noise. That noise that is very vocal, right? And like, I don't know if Praveen must have seen this. There was this photographer who was under ISIS capture for like 8-9 months or something. And he gave an interview to BBC yesterday or day before. And one of the pertaining things he said, which I have also written in the past, he said one of the biggest mistakes, not mistakes, but things that happened, was the amplification of the ISIS voice by Western media.
May I just...
Yeah.
The question was asked by Sushant and someone else about motivation of Indian jihadists. And one of the fascinating motivators is Karen, the Philippine national, who's awaiting extradition. Yeah. And when you look at the Twitter messages with which Arib Majid was radicalized by Karen, this hardcore ISIS radicalizer allegedly, it's just lurid. It's like a Mills and Boons romance thing with, the niqab on. It's like basically come to the Islamic State and you will get laid. And she's in Manila. She's got nothing to do with the Islamic State. And Arib is going on and on and on with this sort of, I don't know how to put it, but this pimply post-adolescent fervor. Are the motivations religious? Are they... I mean, what? So it's...
I think there was a similar case involving a woman in Argentina also. Yes. So there are a couple of such cases like this. That's what I'm coming to the next question which Ketan asked, I think. What is the incentive? God knows. Right, because one person would say it's ideology, one would go after a woman, third would say it's just my fantasy, it's an utopian thing that I'm going to take part in. So there is,
I may just come in momentarily.
yeah.
There was one case of a chap arrested in West Bengal who, after much interrogation, came to the confess that all he wanted to do was cut someone's head off.
But this isn't surprising. Judge in Ahluwalia who did the only survey that I know of with terrorists,
Yeah.
Khalistanis. So had a control question in his survey, and it was quite a largish sample, 500-600. And so there was, I'm angry with the Golden Temple attack, and I hate Indira Gandhi, and all these are 10 questions. There's one control question put in a shockier for the hell of it. And much to Dr. Puri's annoyment, I think 85% answered shockier, which was of course the wrong answer.
Right. Yeah. So it's
It's the correct answer.
Honest.
He's looking for an identity. Well, it's not and he finds an outlet where he'll suddenly be romanticized, he'll get laid, he'll get laid, and
yeah.
it's just breaking away.
Yeah. So there's no single sort of thing. But
it's not a great analogy, between Khalistan movement and the Islamic State.
Sorry,
It's not a great analogy.
no, I don't think he's making an analogy though. It's just an example of what someone has studied.